Hello, just want to speculate, discuss what can be done to end the war in Syria. Um, the situation there is horrible. There's no question about that. And as I've previously stated, I believe it is the defining conflict of the 2010s. Um, the world has seen images of little boy Umran Daknish, who was involved in an airstrike in a rebel-held area of Aleppo. He survived the airstrike, but he was covered in dust and blood. And I think to say it shocked the world would be slightly misleading because, firstly, there's been many other horrifying images, but on some level, the world has been desensitized to what's going on in Syria because it's become the norm. Um, but every conflict has its iconic images, and certainly this is going to be one of them. I saw one post that had Obama and Putin. Obviously, it was photoshopped. It had Obama and Putin talking, and this little boy in the middle of them, and saying the world is doing nothing about Syria. So the follow-up question to that is, what can the world do about Syria? Syrians understandably feel the world has let them down, but what can the world do? What is the answer to this? There is no easy answers, but I believe that some of the following things may help alleviate the situation. Firstly, let's face it, what's fueling this conflict is arms. Okay, the Aleppo's basically virtually nothing left for the city. It looks like an earthquake zone. It just looks like a completely shattered city, and it's one of the world's oldest cities. So it certainly isn't the first time in its history that's seen warfare, but probably not on this scale ever. And we're talking millennia of history. Um, but clearly, the war is being fueled by arms. And what seems to be happening, and I'm just an observer, is that the major powers are fueling it based on the respective side that they're politically aligned with for whatever reason. So Russia and Iran is backing the Assad regime, Saudi Arabia, America, and other Western powers are backing the rebels, which is a blanket term. Um, you know, it, and that's what's fueling this conflict. Neither side is backing down. The Assad regime certainly isn't showing any weakness, but every time it looks like they may be on the ascendancy, then the rebels look like they are on the ascendancy. And like I say, the rebels is a very, very blanket term. This is not a two-way conflict. There's many factions involved, and various rebel groups are now fighting among each other. Certainly, there's hardline Islamists among them, the likes of ISIS and the Al Nusra Front, but there are other groups as well, I imagine from the early days of the war. I think the only way this is going to end is if the major powers say, okay, let's put politics aside. This is going to sound really naive on my part, but let's put this pawn that is Syria, that stop playing games and just stop funding the respective combatants on the ground. Now, the combatants will not like that, obviously. The rebels will be furious that they're not getting arms from the West, and the Assad government probably wouldn't like the fact if Russia stopped supporting it. Russia's deeply entrenched in this conflict, and incidentally, I make no apologies for the very vocal video I made the other day. I haven't looked at the comments section yet, but I noticed it's been thumbed down 3 times, thumbed up once. Well, inevitably, you criticise Russia, the Putin apologists come out in force. I make no apology for that because, firstly, the little boy was most likely injured in a Russian airstrike because it was in a rebel area. But that's, he's a small, small personification of the amount of civilians that have been killed by Russian arms. And I'm not just pointing the finger at Russia. The West has been arming rebel groups as well, and the West also has blood on its hands in that regard. But the only way this is going to end is if the arms are cut off from both sides, and it can't be one side. It can't be a case that the West stops arming and the various rebel factions, or the Kurds for that matter, and the Assad government just pulverizes them and annihilates them. That isn't going to work because let's not forget Assad's brutality is what started this conflict in the first place. People conveniently forget that. They look at ISIS, but they forget the fact that Assad basically started this war with the brutality of his regime. And it's not a case that he was just targeting Islamists. That is a callous lie. It insults the Syrian men, women, and children that were persecuted by this awful regime. It's estimated up to 300 people a month are dying in Syrian jails, tortured in horrible ways. This is a barbaric, evil regime as far as I'm concerned. But the fact of the matter is, it is still the government in Syria. So cut off the arms. The major powers, US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, needs to stop supplying the various combatants. Now, there will still be rogue arms dealers because there always is in these situations, but they will be significantly less of an input than the major powers. That will presumably cut off the supplies, which will presumably decrease the intensity of fighting. I mean, this might sound incredibly naive on my part, but you would think that would be the case. As for ISIS, which is the worst of the worst among the rebel groups, if we could put it that way, I don't even class ISIS as a rebel group. I class ISIS as ISIS, a vicious terrorist organization that has exploited the situation. I believe the other warring parties need to get together just for this reason to wipe out ISIS. I believe ISIS need to be wiped off the face of the earth, and I agree with those who say that you simply cannot bring ISIS into negotiations, not an organisation that enslaves women, throws homosexuals off buildings, etc. And that's not to say the Assad regime isn't also brutal, it is, but it is the government, that's the reality of the situation. Um, I think it's a mistake to focus too much on the political setup of Syria. I think the most pressing issue is to relieve the humanitarian situation. The way to do that is to end the war. It's the only way to do it. Um, Certainly, there's going to be disagreements and very, very tense negotiations as the post-war setup. But I think it's a mistake to focus too much on that now. The immediate priority has to be ending this war. Um, I mean, 5 years of hell, and it looks like there's no end in sight. There's certainly war fatigue, and yet it goes on and on and on. It's far worse than the Bosnian War in that sense, because the Bosnian War was certainly brutal, but it had the end in sight, and it finally came to an end. This is like the Bosnian War plus 1 year. Has this been going on 5 years? The Bosnian War was 3.5, 4 years. Um, it's going to end up more like the Iran-Iraq war, like a constant quagmire patrician war. And that's a horrifying thought that this thing could still go on several years from now. But it has to end because this country is being pulverized. You know, neither side, if they think that they're helping Syria, they're not. And I know that the rebel side cannot imagine Assad in power. That's their goal, to remove Assad. But talking about power at this stage, the priority has to be simply ending the war. Then they can get into those complicated negotiations about who is in power and who isn't. But you know, the combatants all have. It sounds almost stupid saying searching for the conscience because it's easy for me to say that in a country that isn't tearing itself apart. Um, but you know, when people say the world doesn't care, I don't think that's true. The world, I mean, when David Cameron and other Western leaders pushed for airstrikes, that was hardly not caring. That was trying to take action in that situation against Islamic State. I don't agree the world doesn't care. It's more a case that the world can't reach a unanimous decision, and that's a tragedy. Russia and the West need to just get together on this issue and end this thing. And you know, pointing fingers. I'm a private citizen. I can, you know, put forward my viewpoint, but I think governments need to work together on this, and I think they can. You know, it's almost like a Cold War conflict when you had during the Cold War there was various very bloody conflicts fueled by both East and West. You know, you had the Soviet Union, backing left wing insurgencies, and you had the CIA and the West backing right wing insurgencies. What's happening in Syria is almost like a mini Cold War playing out in one country, and it's just it's awful. I just can't rationally comprehend that the sheer death toll is. I recently saw a young man actually was running dance classes, and his dance studio looked like any normal dance studio around the world, except that it was in Aleppo. And within the place, it looked normal. He went outside; it was just rubble. And this brave young man is trying to keep up some sense of normality amidst this very surreal, awful situation. So yeah, I'm just kind of putting forward my views as to how this can be ended. I don't think you can bring ISIS into negotiations because what they want is absolute subservience to non-believers. In its own way, that's also what the Assad regime wants, but the Assad regime is not really Islamist in nature. It's just like any dictatorship; it wants to stay in power. But it's not based on religious fanaticism in the same way. Also, it is the de facto government of Syria at this time. That doesn't mean it always has to be. Um, I think the reason the rebels wouldn't want a ceasefire is because they think, oh, well, that just leaves Assad in power. Point is, if they are fighting for the Syrian people, they need to consider also ending this. But so does Assad. I mean, Assad and his propagandists claim that they don't target civilians, which is, of course, a lie. You know, whenever they've done interviews, it's just an outright lie, and no one can. The point is, no one is innocent in this conflict. But the question now is, before all the finger pointing, there has to be. The toll in Syria is anywhere from 270,000 to 470,000. This is a major, major war, and it's just a country that's being left in the wilderness, and it's. I don't agree with the statement the world doesn't care. It's not so much that the world doesn't care; it's that no one can agree what the right approach is. That's a problem. Incidentally, those who blindly praise Russia, and okay, I'm being a bit partisan here, but I think it is important to say those who blindly praise Russia and blame the West for everything are ignoring the fact that if Russia is such a great savior, why is Russia not taking a single refugee? Now, I know Russia is not as wealthy a country as some Western countries, but Russia is absolutely in its neck in this conflict. They've been a major, major actor in this. So, Russia is a vast country. If they can have wealthy oligarchs, um, you'd think the whole of Russia there would be some sort of scheme for helping Syrian refugees. So I just think it's a perverse joke to try and claim that Russia's the great savior of Syria. They haven't helped a single refugee, and they've been, you know, directly responsible for a lot of the airstrikes that have killed civilians. I would argue much more than the West has. And okay, I'm being partisan, but what I think where the West is culpable is that I mean, the United States, Britain, France, have been putting money into rebel groups without really analysing who's moderate and who's not. And yeah, that probably has helped ISIS along the run of things. I don't agree that the West, as a policy matter, has armed ISIS. That would make no sense because ISIS, has the West on the top of its target list with what's happening in France and Germany. So why that would make no sense whatsoever. It would be like grabbing a scorpion by the tail. As a policy matter, it makes no sense. Strategically, why would the West want to do that? It makes no sense. So those who just come out with these idle statements, oh, the West created and funds ISIS, um, inadvertently maybe it did, but as a policy matter, I don't think so. Inadvertently, yes. Deliberately, no. And I'm yet to see someone actually provide evidence to say the West, as a policy matter, created ISIS. It makes no sense, given that ISIS is murdering Western civilians in Nice and Paris and Brussels and so on. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. The only hope is that there were places 50. I mean, Vietnam is a good example. Vietnam was obviously a major conflict, horrifying conflict. Now, Vietnam today, it's a fast growing economy. It's pretty politically stable. Okay, it's still a communist country, but it's politically stable, and it's come. it almost looks like a different country from the days of the Vietnam War. And that was 50 years ago. So maybe Syria in the year 2066 will look like it had never seen this. One can only hope. But I just hope this ends as soon as possible. I really do.